Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to our fifth and final day of our Coastal Week webinar series. All of this leading up to Coastal Day, which is scheduled for Monday, March 30th at CPRA's campus in downtown Baton Rouge. As we go through our events, we have many events scheduled for the day, starting off Monday morning at 8 a.m. for the Coastal Connect Networking and Matchmaking event. This is at the LSU River Center for River Studies. This is our business-to-business event sponsored by CTAC and Apex. If you have any interest or questions about that, reach out to louisianactac.org. That's CTAC, louisianactac.org. Following our business-to-business event, we're going to move down to the Capitol for the briefing in the governor's press room. That's where GOCA leadership and CPRA leadership are going to give the outlook for coastal restoration and hurricane protection for the upcoming year. Following that briefing at 2, we're going to slip down to the atrium in the Capitol for our outreach to legislatures. That is an opportunity for you to meet and greet your legislators. Also, Monday at 2:30 in the Oliver Pollock Room, you have the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Open House. That's going to be a very special event, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. From 3 to 5, we have the CPRA-led Coastal Construction Project Forecast. This is where CPRA is going to walk through all the projects we have coming up for bid in the next 12 to 18 months. That's going to be at the LaSalle building in downtown Baton Rouge in the LaBelle Room. It's also going to have a virtual opportunity where you can either watch it live or go back later in the event if you need to see it and watch it then. Our culminating event for Monday will be our 5 p.m. crawfish boil and reception at the Pentagon Barracks. Coast Builders and Coast Builders Coalition and the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana are the sponsors of this event, and we thank them very much for that. While that may be the last thing on Monday, we actually have one more event on Tuesday, March 31st. This is our partner-led coastal project forecast, where our partners, our NGOs, our levee districts, the parishes that we do work with, will be giving their construction forecast for the next 12 to 18 months. Again, on March 30, 2026, from 2:30 to 4 at the Oliver Pollock Room in the Galvez building will be the Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group, LATIG, annual meeting in Baton Rouge. This is their annual meeting. This will be the first time they're going to do an in-person event in several years. Not only will they be there, we're going to have representatives from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWF, and the Restore Council. They'll be in attendance at the open house as well. This would be the first opportunity for all three organizations that control and work with us for the Deepwater oil spill funding. So again, we're here for our webinars. We've had a very good week of webinars. This is our 5th and final day. Any of these webinars that you may have happened to miss, you can always go on to CPRA's Venmo or CPRA's YouTube to watch those again. We led off Monday with Dr. Mike Miner talking about harnessing natural processes to restore coastal wetlands. Tuesday, we had Danielle Ricciardi talking about the Davis Pond freshwater diversion. Wednesday, we had a great presentation by Brian Gossman talking about crevasses and land building in the Mississippi River Delta. And that led very nicely into a great presentation by Byrne Wood and Natalie Mathern talking about landscaping as a better way, landscaping a better coast, terraces as a restoration tool. And today, our final day, we have Elizabeth Jarrell and Darren Lee. Elizabeth is going to talk about hydrologic restoration. Darren's going to talk about vegetative plantings and the ability to capture sand on barrier islands. So again, we want you to connect with us. Go to our webpage, coastal.la.gov. That's where you can view all of the presentations previously on as well. You can also go to coastal.la.gov to give us our questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth to start talking about engineering with nature, hydrologic restoration, and vegetative plantings.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. Okay. This week we've been giving a series of presentations about the types of coastal projects that we build that really take advantage of natural processes, so engineering with nature. And I'm going to talk a little bit about hydrologic restoration projects and go through a few examples as an overview or an introduction to this project type. This slide I think you may have seen before if you've been watching these presentations. It goes through some of the principles established for engineering with nature. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but tried to capture some of the ways that hydrologic restoration projects meet these priorities. So we can produce efficiencies by creating connections or recreating connections that improve drainage and reduce flooding. We're definitely using natural processes in doing so by reestablishing natural flows that support improved conditions for the soils and then the vegetation that are meant to be in these wetland areas. That habitat improvement leads to greater benefits, broader benefits in the area. And often these projects are constructed or monitored in coordination with other agencies. So we're taking advantage of and promoting collaboration. This is a figure from the 2013 Coastal Master Plan that provides an overview conceptually of hydrologic restoration. I'm going to walk through a few examples of these types of projects, and you'll see that they vary in terms of the specific features that they include, depending on where they're built, what type of environment, the needs in that area. But generally, these are some of the main things that you might see. You might see dredging of old channels that used to exist that have filled in. You might see cuts made in spoil banks or other gaps that are going to allow reconnection to freshwater inputs that can help reduce salinity and bring in fresh water that can also carry sediment and improve situations where water might have become stagnant. Often hydrologic restoration projects include vegetative planting as well. So I will talk a little bit about some of the planting that's been done for one project in particular that I'm going to focus on today. So today I will focus on the Amite River Diversion Canal Hydrologic Restoration Project, or PO 142. That's one that we monitor out of the New Orleans office, so I'm more familiar with that project. And afterwards, I'll give just some really quick examples of a couple of other hydrologic restoration projects that are monitored by the Thibodeau office, just to kind of show the variety of features and locations and how these projects can look in different places. But for PO 142, this is the general location we're looking at, kind of between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in the Maurepas Swamp, west of Lake Maurepas. You zoom in to the project itself, and we'll see a lot of maps like this, but this one really shows the specific features that were constructed. You see the Amite River Diversion Canal in the map, kind of the straight line along the bottom of the image, and then 3 conveyance channels that we constructed coming off of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the canal and what those conveyance channels do, but that's basically what the project entailed, cutting through the spoil bank on the north side of the canal and building those conveyance channels to move water in and out of the swamp. You can see the details of, the sizes of those. And there were a few other features as well, like a cut in the railroad that you can see marked with the red dot at the top of the map. And another feature that's important to note is along the conveyance channels, when they were dredged out and constructed, we built spoil berms along the sides with gaps between them, and then those were planted. And so a lot of the improvement that we see currently in the area is from the actually directly planting those berms. Another kind of in-between image, zoomed sort of halfway out, you can see the full project area here with a primary area of impact outlined around those conveyance channels, and in secondary area of impact that's a little bit larger around that. This area is primarily cypress tupelo swamp, so we'll talk more about those tree species, but it's a swamp area, and hydrologic restoration projects tend to be in swamp areas, although we will talk about one that's in a marsh later in the talk. Most of this area is owned by LDWF, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife Fisheries. It's part of their Maurepas Swamp Wildlife Management Area. And I just highlight that as one point of collaboration with this project. We work really closely with them as the managers of the area when we're going out to do field work, or if there are any, anticipated changes or anything like that. All right. Recently, the state claimed some additional land in addition to that WMA land that was already there, just to the north of the conveyance channels. And so that will come into play later when we talk about some potential future steps for this project. All right, the history of the area, just quickly, that canal, the Amite River Diversion Canal, was constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 50s and 60s to reduce flooding in communities. When they built it, they built spoil banks along the north and south side of the canal. And what happened on the marshes, or sorry, the swamps on either side, is that the spoil banks created a barrier for flow, which resulted in impoundment of the swamp and kind of a situation where those swamps were permanently flooded. That flooding contributed to degradation of the swamp over time, particularly in the area where the project is to the north. And there were also additional stressors at play. Earlier in history, logging, subsidence is always happening, lack of sediment being introduced from a freshwater supply. And salinity intrusion was a problem for a while. That definitely contributed to the degradation, but it's been less of an issue in recent years since the closure of Mr. Go. So the project goal, kind of high level, big picture, is to reverse the trend of degradation that resulted from construction of this canal. Here's some pictures of the construction of the project, which happened in 2016 to 2017. On your right, you can see excavation of one of the conveyance channels. So that's kind of what that looked like, digging a channel through the swamp. And then on the, I got my right and left mixed up, but on the other side, you can see the gap banks between the spoil banks. And that is important because we didn't want to recreate the same problem that we were trying to solve. And so having these gaps between the spoil banks that we created along the conveyance channels allowed for flow into and out of the swamp. As I mentioned before, those spoil banks or berms were planted, and so I'll talk just a little bit about that. First, they were treated for invasive species, mainly Chinese tallow, which is present in the area. They were treated several times for invasive species, and once the assessment showed that had been successful, then they were planted. And so in 2019, we planted 1,350 saplings with these plastic nutria exclusion devices on the base, which you can see in the photo here. And you can also see a breakdown of the species that were planted. And that planting was very successful. So there were a few assessments done. This one was in October of 2019. A few months after the planting, and you can see that survival was around 90% or higher, depending on the species. And if you go out there now, you can see that the planted trees have continued to grow and thrive on those spoil berms. We've also conducted more recently, in 2024, a test planting in the actual interior of the swamp where a lot of the damage and degradation has occurred. We did a test planting because there was a lot of concern that in spite of the project, being successful in, reintroducing that flow and hydrologic exchange, the soils in the interior swamp are still pretty loose and wet. And so we wanted to see how well a planting would do. We weren't sure before we scaled it up to a larger area. So in 2024, 630 small trees were planted, all bald cypress, and they were different ages from 1 year old to 3 year old. Some of them were bare root, and we did that intentionally so that we could see, if there was a difference in their survival or their condition after some time, if it was better to plant younger or older trees. We also tested planting trees in 3 separate areas, all selected because they had relatively high elevation and good soils, but just to see if maybe there was a difference that we could identify if the trees did better in one area over another. We used colored stakes to identify the tree age and source so we could track success, and then use that to inform any future plantings. And we used the nutrient exclusion devices again here. So this is a newer planting, obviously, but we did go back and assess it last October 2025, and we had good survival. You can see some differences across the planting areas. There were just fewer trees in general planted in planting area 3, and that's why the numbers are lower there. But you can also see some differences in condition, so that's what the color coding here on the graph is for. A means the trees were alive when we monitored them, D means dead, and S means stressed. So you can see that there are quite a few more proportionally stressed trees in planting area 1 than the others, and that's something that we're going to track over time and just see if that continues to be the case. Maybe we can identify what environmental conditions are leading to that stress, likely flooding. So specific objectives of the project, we already talked about kind of what the big picture goal is, but specifically what we wanted to do with this project was increase hydrologic connectivity between the canal and the swamp. What that is intended to do is flush out stagnant water, bring in nutrients, oxygen, and sediment. We wanted to improve tree productivity and germination, so we wanted to start to have new trees establish as well as maintaining health of the existing trees. That would happen through reduced flooding, allowing time for the seeds to germinate when the soils are drier. They need a dry period in order for germination to occur. And we wanted to reduce the pattern that we had started to see of swamp converting to marsh and potentially ultimately to open water. So we set up a monitoring plan to try to assess how well we were doing towards those objectives. And the monitoring can be divided into sort of different components or categories. We look at hydrology, we look at soil, and we look at vegetation. And we'll talk more about each of these. There's, in each case, a couple of different things that we look at or a couple of different ways that we look at that information. The map on the slide shows you where our monitoring sites are. So we have a CRIMS site in the location. That's a coastal reference site that there's a huge network of them across the coast, if you're not aware. And one of them happens to be in our project area. So we take advantage of that and use data from CRIMS 8. And then we established some project-specific sites that are marked as PO 142, 1, 2, and vegetation is monitored at all of those sites, and hydrology is monitored at the 2 of them that are where the circles are colored in. In addition to the sites, those 4 sites that are in the project area, there are 2 CRIMS sites that are nearby in similar habitat. Those are shown on the map as well, CRIMS 38 and CRIMS 5845. And those are the reference sites that we use to see how well our area is doing compared to a nearby area that's outside of the influence of the project features. So I'll go through each of these really quickly just because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll touch on some of the results that we've seen for each one of those categories of monitoring. So for hydrology, some of the most clear information that we have about project impact is from what we call a synoptic surveys, where a field crew went out and took measurements along the transects that you can see marked on the images. And they went out once in the spring and once in the fall of 2019. And they measured discharge and flow and velocity and several other factors. But what we're looking at here is discharge. And the reason they chose to go out in the spring and then the fall is that, as you can see from the arrows, the flow is in the opposite direction in the actual canal. And so they wanted to see how those how that difference would impact flow in and out of the channels. And you can see that it does. So when the water is moving out towards the Blind River and towards Lake Maurepas, as you can see in the top image, kind of everything is moving out. So water is also moving out of the swamps through those conveyance channels. But when water is moving in from the Blind River and Lake Maurepas, it's also moving up into the channel. So you do see that change in direction, which indicates that we achieved that reconnection that we were trying to get by building these conveyance channels. We also have hydro data from our hydro stations, which I showed on the previous map. I'm not going to go into it. That data are not as clear in terms of what the impact has been, but there's some indication that water levels have reduced slightly, at least at one of the monitoring stations. In terms of soils, one of the things that we knew about the site was that, as I mentioned previously, the soils that are there are very loose and very wet. Compared to other analyses that have been done, the values that we see in this area are indicative of permanently flooded marshes. Permanently flooded swamps, not great conditions for trees to grow. And so what we would want to see from the project and from the reintroduction of that hydrologic connection is an increase in bulk density, so the soil's getting firmer, and a decrease in moisture content over time, or pre versus post construction. If you kind of squint at these, you can maybe see a little bit of a trend like that, but it's not conclusive. And part of the reason for that is that Hurricane Ida hit this area almost directly, passed right over this area in 2021. And so the values that you're seeing for 2021 are almost definitely impacted by that hurricane. And so I think, over time, as we continue to monitor and look at this, we may see the trends that we're looking for, but we need to kind of wait and see with additional data what those longer term trends are going to look like. In terms of vegetation, we do several different types of vegetation surveys at all of our monitoring sites across the coast and at these as well. From the overstory surveys, which are the forest surveys looking at the larger trees in the area, for this project, we're not seeing any evidence yet for changes in canopy cover or tree growth. But what we do see is what's shown here, and we see it in both the understory and the herbaceous surveys, but I'm only showing the herbaceous surveys here. There are some new trees popping up. So the light blue in this graph is bald cypress, which is one of the species that we want to see. And these are young trees that are appearing at the different project sites where we haven't seen them before. And so that's an indication that maybe potentially we are getting recruitment and germination of new trees, which would be great. And we want to continue to monitor that and make sure that is what's happening. In addition to looking at the trees through surveys, we also do habitat analyses. This is actually done for us by the USGS, but it allows us to look at larger scale trends in the area. And really assess that idea of conversion between swamp and marsh or to open water. So far, we only have one analysis that was conducted in 2017, and that's what's shown here. But there's another one underway right now looking at data from 2024. And so when we get that new analysis, we can do a comparison and see how things have changed over time. Okay, so wrapping up with this project as an example, PO 142, we do see evidence for increased hydrologic connectivity. The long-term impacts on soil and vegetation are to be determined, so we just need more time and more data to see what those longer-term trends are. The plantings that we've done on the spoil berm show high survivability and also natural recruitment, which I didn't talk about, but we are seeing that as well. And the swamp test plantings also seem to be successful. So they're newer. We need a little more time to make sure that that success will last, but it seems promising, and we think there's potential maybe to do some additional plantings in the future. That newly acquired land I mentioned, that could be a place that we could look to do some of the new plantings. All right, so very quickly, because these are not my projects, I want to just show you some information about a couple other examples of hydrologic restoration projects that have been constructed by CPRA. So BA 34-2 is a hydrologic restoration and vegetative planting in the Des Allemands swamp. It's a QUIPRA project that CPRA built with EPA. It was constructed in 2018 in Barataria Basin. The picture on this slide shows what that swamp looked like before the project, and you can see that herbaceous marsh plants have started to creep into the swamp. So the goals were to, again, restore hydrology, similar to the previous project we talked about, increase productivity of the forest, again, cypress tupelo forest, increase canopy cover, etc. And this project, the construction features included gaps. So there were 6 gaps built to help with water exchange and flow into and out of this previously impounded area. And with this project, they did see almost immediate success in terms of the vegetation response, with an increase in forest canopy cover that's noticeable and significant from pre-construction conditions to post-construction, and that's what's shown in the graph here. The next one is TE44, the North Lake Méchant Land Bridge Restoration Project. And this one is interesting because it's in the marsh instead of in the swamp. And we don't usually think about hydrologic restoration in marsh, but this is a good example of where those 2 types of restoration have been combined to get better benefits for both. So this is, again, a QUIPRA project. This one was built earlier, 2003 to 2009, Terrebonne Parish. You can see in the image the polygons that are blue are showing where marsh creation, where marsh was created or built, and then the other features, the dots, show where different hydrologic restoration features were added. So most of those consisted, in this case, of plugs instead of openings, because the idea was keeping the salt water out and keeping the area fresher. And this project has been successful at that goal. And so not only was the marsh built and created as proposed, but there has been an observation indicating that the vegetation has remained fresher or become fresher over time. And that's what you can see in the graph here. So the dark or the blue color that you see in the earlier years is Spartina alterniflora, which is indicative of salt marsh. And in the later years, after the project had been in place, you see a greater variety of species, and many of those are indicative of brackish or intermediate marsh, which is what the project was trying to achieve. So in conclusion, hydrologic restoration, sometimes including vegetative planting, takes advantage of natural processes, processes like hydrologic connection, restoring what was naturally there prior to addition of some other feature that was built, improving drainage, reducing flooding, potentially impacting salinity and water quality as well. Vegetation might respond quickly, or it might be slow and hard to interpret what the trends are until you have a longer term data set. And other project features sometimes are helpful to add into hydrologic restoration, whether that's a marsh creation like we showed in the last project, or the plantings or things like that. Sometimes you need to kind of add those features together to get good results. And there's a couple of links here at the bottom for more information. All of the monitoring data that I shared is from information that's publicly available. You can find the project information in our SIMS library from the CPRA website, and information from the Coastwide Reference Monitoring System, or CRIMS, at their website, which is shown here. Right. So I'm going to move on to the next presentation by Darren Lee.
All right, thanks. And we'll continue this with a discussion of natural processes of managing wind and establishing vegetated communities. So we'll talk a little bit more about establishing vegetated communities, and we'll kind of focus on barrier islands with a little bit of marsh in there as well. So again, this whole week talking about natural processes and working with natural processes. A quote that I like is, we don't build barrier islands, we place sediment in configurations that develop into barrier islands. And kind of maybe I should amend that to say, initially, some of the habitats and some of the barrier island features that are there are not going to come directly out of the project construction. So we have some birds that will immediately start to utilize this habitat type, but then we have some other birds that it's going to take time, and it's going to take development of these habitats and these communities in order to get the goals and objectives that potentially the project has. And so within that, and adapting for these natural processes, some that have been talked about in other projects, and we have them here on barrier islands, is subsidence and sea level rise. So again, if we want certain elevations and we want those in the long term, we have to think about how this new sediment is going to load and compact the underlying sediment. We have to think about how sea level is going to rise, and we have to think about how high and how much sediment we want to place in order for these projects to last the time that we want them to last. We also have sediment transport, so waves can move the sand around. And again, if you've been to the beach, you all know this. You stand in the surf and you feel the sand kind of moving around your feet. So again, how are these waves going to transport sediment? Winds are also going to transport sediment, and that's how, the main process I'm going to talk about today, and how we think about that and manage that in these projects. And then again, vegetation has to colonize. We have to take this project, which you see here is just a bunch of new sand that's been under the surface of the water where we've dredged it up, and we have to now establish these vegetation communities in this environment. And then the last process I'm going to talk about, and you've heard about it a lot here, is time. So even in the previous presentation, we've talked about soils and how those soils are being affected by the project. And sometimes that means just we have to allow time to pass in order for that to happen. And it's the same with these processes of vegetation colonization and winds moving sand. So here's an example of a project that we did early on. And, how do we get from this condition here in the upper slide, and you see the oil facility in the background behind this barrier island. We pumped a bunch of sand. We have some sand fence and some plantings. And then the other image is the same island, and I've highlighted that same facility, and that's 9 years post-fill. So the idea is, what do we think about and what do we do in managing these natural processes to get us from this initial construction and conceptualization of what it is we're trying to achieve to getting these habitats and these environments in a period of time that's acceptable to us. So again, wind transport, scientists, engineers, we have to come up with fancy terms. It's called aeolian transport or aeolian processes, and it is the erosion, transport, and deposition of sediments that are caused by the wind at or near the surface of the earth. So again, we place the sediment. We know the sediment's going to move from somewhere. It's going to erode. We know that it's going to be moved and transported. And then where do we want it to be deposited, and how do we want it to be deposited? Those are all things that we need to think about in planning achieving our goals and objectives on a project. And so lucky for us, a lot of this has been studied extensively. So, just again briefly, saltation is the term for the movement of the sand. Again, if you've gone to the beach on a windy day and you kind of see the sand moving along as the wind transports it, and that's been studied. It's kind of how it moves and where it moves and what it takes to move it. The other thing is wind velocity, and again, how wind interacts with objects in and around its movement. And so again, wind will increase at the sides of a feature, and it will slow down on both the front side and the back side of the feature. And ultimately, all of that really, and all of that research gives us the ability to predict and utilize those physics and those processes to achieve our goals. And so again, what do we want to do? We want to retain the place sediment. We want to keep the sediment that's there in place. We want to maintain that volume for as long as we can, because again, this wave transport, this subsidence is interacting, etc. So can we use these sand fences to stockpile sand, keep it in place? Can we use the vegetation to do that? Can we also make these unique habitats? So dunes are unique habitats, and so by creating these habitats, we get different habitats that are not just there after construction, and then higher elevation. So let's say we build an island to an 8-foot elevation, but we also know maybe we would like it higher. So we can use a sand fence and the wind to give us additional elevation without having to pump that elevation. And so again, the things we need to think about is the sediment going to move? Is it high enough? Is it dry enough? Is it of a size that the wind's going to move it? Where is the sediment going to come from? And that's important. And where do we want it to be deposited and how we want it to be deposited to create these features that we want? So sand fencing, again, is our main tool that we use here. And you see that on beaches all over the place. For those up north, you're going to call it snow fencing. It's kind of the same thing. And you're trying to do the same thing. You're capturing snow. We're capturing sand. So it's really about creating this area of lower wind speed, both in front of and behind the fence, that causes the sand to deposit on the downwind side, predicting where that downwind side is going to be. Is where is the sand going to come from and what winds are going to move the sand. And we'll talk about that. But the space between the slats allows the sand to blow through. It reduces the velocity. It drops the sand. It keeps it on the fence. Things that you can think about is the height of the fence, the spacing between the slats, and the wind speed and direction really affect how much and when and where that sand's going to deposit. Again, it's been studied a lot, so we can utilize that. But we've also tried different sand fence designs. So if you look at in the area of the blue, you can see some of the different sand fences we've utilized, and we've utilized those on initial projects. Also, a lot of work, again, other states. This is a manual from Texas that shows how to place sand fences under certain conditions if you want to do maintenance events in smaller areas. But really, I'm going to focus on sort of our big scale restoration that we really started in the late 90s and early 2000s. But, we're basically, unlike if you go to, let's say, Florida and there's a beach and they're nourishing a beach, we're going to basically nourish a whole island, and we're going to create this big bare area. And so where is that sand going to come from, right? We don't just have sand on the beach. We have sand in this large dune platform. We have sand on the backside. And so when we look at what winds move the sands, there's again, science and engineering has been done to show, and just as an example, a particle that's 0.15 millimeter, which is in the grain size of sands and fine sands, it takes a wind speed of 5.1 meters per second. And I should have done the conversion for all the English folks, but a scientist went in meters. So 5.1 meters per second is what it takes to start moving that sand. So when does that happen? So if you look at this graph, you basically see that those winds that are really moving the sands are in the winter and into the spring, and then again in the fall. So summer, the wind's not typically blowing fast enough to move the sand. So in the winter, when that happens, where do these winds come from? So anything blue, green, or light blue up at the top of that scale, that's above that 5.1 meters, and that's going to move the sand. And so looking at this windrows, you see again this large proportion of the winds are going to move that sand when they're coming from the north, right? And if you look at the southeast, there's more time the wind blows from the southeast, typical here, but yet very rarely does it exceed this 5.1 meters and going to move that sand. And that's important, again, from us, from a restoration standpoint, about thinking, where's the sand going to come from and where do we want it deposited? This is an example, and you can see on the left, that's the Gulf side of the island, and on the right is the bay side of the island. And you can see that sand fence is south of the fence. And so again, we place this large amount of sediment, the wind blows, and it's blowing from the north. Our source of sediment is from the north, and we're going to capture it on the south side of the fence. That's different than, we've seen in other places where people just nourish the beach. The beach is a source of sand. The sand's only going to move when it comes from the south. So again, in thinking about where to put our fencing and where to place our fencing, it's important to understand where your sediment's going to come from and what winds are going to move it. Our sands in these early projects come a lot from the north side in this big bare area. Here's an example, and this is an elevation change map. So we have two surveys, we subtract those surveys, and so you can see these features kind of in the middle of this island here that look like the little lines in a lighter color. That means elevation gain. The red means elevation loss. Again, where does our sediment come from? It's being eroded from locations in the island. The fences are catching it and stacking it up. But note how those fences are oriented. You know, we have to think about, did we build the dunes and did we stockpile and hold the sand where we want the sand to perform, and what are the impacts of that? So in this particular aspect, you'll notice this is a sort of a cartoon drawing of kind of some impacts here. When the water comes over the island eventually, you'll see that this does not create this protected linear feature across a dune across the island, and some of the water goes across the island and it actually focuses in areas in front of some of these dunes where there's then a small protected area behind. And so the impacts of that is you get scour in the areas where the water can pass behind, and you get some protected area, but you get scour in this area. You take the vegetation off, you expose that sand body again, and you allow the wind to continue to blow it. Possibly not what you want to do. Secondly, that sand that is stacked in the back, and that's looking toward the bay side of the island, that sand that's stacked in the back is not providing you this reservoir of sand that when the waves come and hit, that is going to transport that sand back towards the beach and nourish the beach. So we're not preventing the overwash with this design, and we're not necessarily creating these dunes in the locations that we want. Another example of a sand fence that was tried, again, now we have this complete linear feature, but we added some wings on it. Again, we saw this sort of idea of focusing of water versus not focusing of water. And again, within this example here, you can see differences in the vegetation communities and survival. So the section of fence we have labeled as A, and I'll go back real quick. So again, you can see what's labeled as the A section on the left. You can see what's labeled as the V section on the right. They actually had enough impact on water flow and overwash that basically it impacted the vegetation survival that we planted. So again, placing these fences and placing these dunes in locations that are focusing the water and not necessarily creating this linear feature have proven to have these impacts that we don't want to have. And so again, typically we've now gone to just simple straight linear fence. And there's a couple of advantages. One, it's cheaper. If you're just going to do a mile of beach, you've got one row of fence. And you can kind of see here, we put gaps every once in a while for the critters and people or whatever to traverse through this fence. But basically it creates one long linear feature. And then if that fills up, which again on the Gulf side here you can see that filled up, we put a second row, that's filled up, and now we've put a third row. And you can keep doing that until the sediment source on the north that's being transported to the south is finally vegetated and the sand stops transporting. But the idea here is that we can create these long linear dune features, and if impacted, that sand that's stored in that feature can then be moved to the beach by the waves. And here's an example years later, I'm pointing out the same facilities on this island, but you can see in a section that got impacted by a storm and high waves. That sand was distributed to help maintain the elevation, but yet wasn't allowed by the second row to go through and across the island. So we can start to create these habitats. We can start to raise the elevation without having to pump the sand or shape the sand with a bulldozer or whatever. We can let the wind do the work for us. The other thing is, but these are temporary. So eventually through this veg succession, and now here's the same island 12 growing seasons later, and you can see, you can't see the fences. The fences have deteriorated and the vegetation has taken over and stabilized this island. And until a huge storm event comes and overwashes this island, which hopefully, again, these dunes are big enough to sort of stop a lot of that process. If they don't, they will release that sand and help maintain the volume and nourish the beach and the island as a whole. If we do beach nourishments, and we do, so out west part of the state, a lot of this is more just of a shoreline beach, sandy beach. And so we still use sand fencing. This is a kind of a typical construction. And the idea is once we've completed the cross section and they've moved on to new sections of the island, we get that sand fencing up as fast as we can. Again, we want to start capturing that sand as fast as we can. And in this case, is typically replacing that sand fencing as far back as we can. We want that sand fencing to give the most time to capture sand, be stabilized by vegetation, and be ready to release that when a big storm. But you don't want to put that sand fencing right up against the shoreline. You don't want it impacted on every storm or every smaller storms. You want it there as a reservoir of sand and also create those habitats. The other thing we can use it for is simply to keep sand out of areas. So here's Elmer's Island. It's again, a wildlife and fisheries property. It's public access to Elmer's Island Beach. And the idea here is public access through these walkways. Don't necessarily want trampling over these dunes and this dune vegetation, again, killing the vegetation, disturbing it, releasing the sand. So we want to let people know, sorry about that, we want to let people know where that access should be. And that access is focused, and it's focused through sand fencing, keeping the sand and keeping the open tracks here where the public can access. Another case of utilizing other techniques, and this is hay bales on Queen Bess. If you see in the upper right of this picture, there's a bunch of limestone, and that was for bird nesting, and it's trying to keep the vegetation from growing. At the same time, we don't want the sand being blown across that. So the idea was to maintain the sand where it was and prevent the sand transport. Didn't want sand fencing because that kind of habitat's not good for bird nesting, but pelicans will nest on top of hay bales. Pelicans will use hay bales to line their nests. This is an important bird nesting island. And so again, this idea of all of these hay bales to create this windbreaks, but in this case, trying to prevent the sand from moving very far in the first place. So it's kind of a twofold process that we can try to manage. Other things out there, the lower right picture is what's called a straw grid. That's used a lot in areas. We haven't used it mainly because it's labor intensive, but they go in and they put straw down in the sand and create this rough surface that prevents the sand from blowing the wind around, and again allows the vegetation to take hold and start to stabilize these areas. We've seeded the upper left. That's an area where we went in and we flew seed over the project when we initially built it. We still had sand fencing, but the idea is we really wanted to stabilize that as quickly as possible. Other things would create like hydromulching. That's where you mix seed and other components and you wet it and you spray it on the surface. It creates sort of a tacky covering. Again, protects the wind, allows that seed to grow real fast. We've not used that. You see that a lot on roadsides. Part of our problem is these islands are so remote. But there are other techniques. As far as vegetative plantings, and you've seen those in some of the pictures and you've heard Elizabeth talk about them, they work the same here. Again, our goals: hold sediment, build elevation, create specific habitats. What habitats are desired, what existed prior to the restoration, and how quickly do we need those habitats. And one of the things we think about in general terms is what's called ecological assembly rules. And basically, it's sort of this idea of what pool of vegetation do you have to choose from, what environmental factors are affecting those pools of vegetation, and how do you select which ones to plant. And so the Barrier Islands are a great example of an extremely harsh environment. Sorry about that again. An extremely harsh environment that basically all this new sand is placed. It's high, it's dry. There are only a few species that really produce and grow in that environment. And so trying to plant all of these species that are going to exist is a waste of time and money. So we really focus on a couple species, getting those established, getting those to grow. Bittered panicum and sea oats are two of the ones that we use a lot. Then we can come in after some habitat has established and we can begin to add additional species. The environment has changed. It's not as much wind-blown sand. It's not as dry. There's more organic matter. It's been flushed by a lot more rain, so there's less salt in the soil. So again, this idea of not jumping out and instantaneously trying to create the environment that you ultimately want. And here's an example of that's one of these projects where you can see the light gray is bare ground. That reduces over time as the vegetation grows. The dark gray at the bottom is other species. So again, other species are starting to encroach and build. And then if you look at the planted species, Panicum marum here, which is the fourth one down, the yellow, you can see it kind of pretty good in 2016. It increases in 2018, but by 2020, it's starting to be a smaller component of the environment because that is a species of disturbance and new sand and blowing around. That's what we planted, but ultimately we know that's not what's necessarily going to be there. However, it's still there. An impact occurs. It can start to reestablish itself. But the idea here is to use those assembly rules to select the species that are good now. And ultimately, if we do our job right, you can't answer the question of whether it's natural or stored. That's the catch-22 of all this restoration with natural processes. You know, if we do our job right, you don't know we've been there, right? This is a case, and I've showed it to you before because you recognize that oil facility, but obviously this is a restored site. I've circled the tops of the old sand fence posts that were there that we created the sand fence. But the other thing with the vegetation, it can continue to grow. So it's hard to see from this perspective, but I'm probably standing about another 4 feet above the top of the sand fence. So if we built that project at 8, the sand filled up the sand fence, a 4-foot sand fence to plus 12, and now I'm another 4 feet above that. So do the math. But again, the vegetation continues to collect that sand and it continues to develop those environments. Again, we can plant marshes. It's pretty much the same process. Here's an example, and Elizabeth has kind of talked about this. You go in, you select those species, you plant them. Here's an example of what it looked like before. Here's 2 years post-construction after we've planted on the right. And then here's 21 years later. Again, you can see still a lot of marsh within that area, predominantly still marsh within that area. And again, this idea of time is that, you know, we pumped this as an example of in 2010. It took about 6 years to achieve its maximum cover. And that maximum cover was at about 75 to 80% of the fill area. You can see most of it was marsh. Some mangrove was starting to develop. But then over the years, now you're probably at 50% mangrove. And that mangrove is, if ultimately what you want, you have to think about how long it's going to take to develop that habitat. And with that, I think we'll stop and we'll try to answer any questions.
So thank you, Darren. Thank you, Elizabeth. We do have time. I have 2 questions for you, Darren. The first one is for you. How important is sand fencing and vegetative planting for the long-term maintenance of Bear Islands?
Well, I think it's critical because, as you know, you can see from some of these pictures how much that sand moves when you first place it. That, you know, if we had to calculate, you know, no vegetative cover and, you know, no capture of that sand by the sand fencing, you know, we probably have to add, and you know, we unfortunately don't have the calculations, but my guess is we probably have to add 10, 15, maybe even 20% more sand, which all is going to cost you a lot more money than some sand fencing and some vegetation plantings. And so, you know, getting that established, getting it covered, and getting it stabilized as quickly as you can is imperative to the long-term viability of those geomorphic features that you've now spent millions of dollars, you know, enhancing and creating.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, the next one's for you. You mentioned swamp test planting. Based on the results and observations, what do you believe some future actions could consist of?
All right, thank you. Yeah, we are looking at that carefully. As I mentioned, those test plantings are fairly recent, and so we do want to continue to monitor them and see how successful they are. We want to keep looking at differences in the growth that we're seeing in survival among the different planting areas to see if we can identify what conditions are leading to the best results. And then we really do want to expand that planting, but we want to make sure when we do, it's going to be successful. So we need to do some scouting of the new areas to the north of the conveyance channels and see which of those, which locations within that area match up with the conditions that we think will be best for planting, and then go from there. But hopefully we can expand and plant some more trees, and that trust that they'll be healthy and that we can also have better soil conditions and get more recruitment and germination of young trees as well.
Great. Well, thank you. That's the last questions we really do have. Thank you both for presenting today. Thank you to all of our presenters who presented this week. I want to give a special thanks to our outreach and engagement team. Put a lot of hard work behind the cameras, which you guys don't see, and making this week happen, as well as getting ready for Monday to make that happen. On behalf of CPRA, I'd like to thank all of the people who tuned in. Thank you very much for watching this week. As a reminder, if there's any of these presentations that you happen to miss, they're on our website, our Vimeo channel, as well as our YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing everybody at Coastal Day on Monday, March 30th. Thank you.